Wade Hollis thought people were things land to take, widows to frighten, wounded boys to use. But he forgot one truth. Ordinary people become powerful when they stop looking away. A widow, an old neighbor, a blacksmith, a frightened young witness, and one haunted cowboy would bring a whole county to its knees. This story teaches us that justice is built by small acts of courage. If you believe in stories with soul, like, comment, share, and subscribe.
The ground did not want to take him. Eliza Calloway drove the shovel down again. And again, the limestone shrugged it back, and her wedding ring scraped along the wooden handle with a small sound she would remember for the rest of her life. The sun was already high. It was not yet 9 in the morning, and the heat lay across the hill country like a hand pressed flat against the back of her neck. She did not stop. She did not cry. She had no tears left. She had spent every one of them in the dark, 2 nights running, with her face in the pillow that still smelled faintly of him. And now there was nothing left in her but a hard, clean, dry place where the grief had burned through. So she dug, above her, on the low ridge that ran along the eastern edge of the ranch. 6 men sat their horses and watched her. They did not call out. They did not come down. They simply sat there, strung along the rise like crows on a fence, and their shadows fell long across the yellow grass and reached almost to the edge of the grave she was digging for her husband. She felt them the way you feel weather coming, a pressure, a change in the air. She knew what they were. She had known since the moment the 2 ranch hands rode in the day before, slow, with their hats in their hands and their eyes on the dirt. And Jonah laid sideways across the saddle like a sack of feed. He fell, they'd said. Horse threw him out by the canyon. He hit his head on the rock shelf. Liza had stood in the doorway and looked at her husband's hands hanging down past the stirrup. Big hands, careful hands. Hands that had broken Green Horse's since before he was old enough to shave. Jonah Calloway did not fall off horses. She'd known it then. She knew it now, with the shovel in her grip and 6 men on the ridge above her. And she said nothing about it. Not to the hands. Not to the preacher. There was a time to say a thing, and there was a time to hold it. Her mother had taught her that, a long way south of here, in a different language, in a kitchen that smelled of corn and wood smoke. Hija, she used to say. The mouth that opens at the wrong moment digs 2 graves. Liza was only digging one today. She set the shovel down at last and climbed out of the hole and stood looking at it. It was deep enough. It would have to be. Her arms were shaking and her palms were raw, and the dress she wore black. The only black she owned. The one she'd married him in dyed dark for mourning, because she couldn't afford another clung to her with sweat. She looked up at the ridge. For a long moment, nobody moved, and the only sound was a mockingbird somewhere in the cedar, running through every song it knew, one after another, indifferent to the dead. Then she turned her back on them, deliberate. She gave them her spine and her steady hands, and not 1 inch of the fear that sat low in her belly like a swallowed stone, because she had figured out something in the last 2 days. Something she could not have put into words, but understood all the way down to the bone. Men like that fed on the flinch. She would not feed them. They buried Jonah Calloway that afternoon, and the whole of Cedar Hollow came. It wasn't much of a town, and it wasn't much of a turnout by the standards of bigger places. But for Cedar Hollow, it was everyone. 30-some souls in their Sunday best, standing in the heat with their hats off. their faces shining. Old Pastor Greer read the words. The wind moved the grass. Somebody's baby fussed and was hushed. Liza stood at the head of the grave and held herself together the way you'd carry a cracked clay jar across a room. Careful, both hands, knowing that the second you let go, the whole thing comes apart in pieces too small to gather. She did not look at the ridge. She didn't have to. She could feel the one man they'd sent. He stood at the back of the gathering, off to the side. Young, no more than 20, with new boots and a band of hammered silver around the crown of his hat and his thumbs hooked in his belt. He didn't take his hat off for the prayer. He didn't bow his head. He just stood there and watched her through the whole of it, slow and easy, the way a man at a stockyard watches a heifer cross the pen, taking inventory after when the others came by to press her hand and say the small, useless kind things people say. Naomi Burke stayed. Naomi was 63 years old and built like a fence post, with a face the sun had been working on for half a century and eyes that didn't miss much. Her own husband had been 12 years in the ground. She'd buried him and kept their place running alone ever since. And she had a way of saying the true thing in the fewest words, which Liza had always loved her for. She waited until the others had gone. Then she came and stood beside Liza at the grave. And the two of them looked down at the raw earth together. He was a good man, Naomi said. He was the best man I ever knew. I know it. Naomi was quiet a moment. Then she nodded toward the road, where the young man with the silver hatband was climbing onto his horse, taking his time about it, making sure they saw him do it. Hollis's boy, I figured. Wade Hollis didn't come himself. No, he sent a child to your husband's funeral to look you over. Naomi said it flat, without heat, which somehow made it worse. That tells you everything you need to know about the man. Liza watched the boy ride off down the lane. The dust hung in the still air behind him a long time before it settled. He thinks I'm alone, she said. You are alone. Honey, Naomi turned to her, and her old eyes were steady and kind, and entirely without comfort. A man like Hollis. He looks at a woman by herself out here, and you know what he sees. He doesn't see a person. He sees a thing that's in his way. A fence he can step over. Land with the lock left hanging open. She paused. Your whole job now, the only job that matters, is to make that man understand you are a person. Not a thing. A person. Because the day he forgets it. That's the day. Something happens to you that nobody can take back. Liza looked at her. How do I do that? I don't rightly know, Naomi said. Nobody ever taught me. Either. I just figured it out one hard day at a time. She reached over and took Liza's raw, blistered hand in both of her own. Gentle as you'd hold an egg. But I'll tell you what I do know. You don't do it by getting small. They want you small. You do it by standing where you stand and refusing to move. And making them be the ones to decide whether. They're the kind of men who'll knock a person down to take what isn't theirs. She squeezed once. Most of them aren't. They just hope you'll save them the trouble of finding out. The mockingbird had gone quiet. The light was turning gold over the limestone ridges, the way it did at the end of a hill country day, the way Jonah had loved. This hour, he used to say, this 1 hour makes the rest of it worth it. Liza closed her eyes for a second. Just one. Then she opened them. Thank you, Naomi. Don't thank me. Just stay alive. I'm getting old, and I haven't got the heart to bury another good one. Naomi let go of her hand and gathered her reins and pulled herself up onto her gray mare with a grunt. She looked down. You need anything. You ride 2 miles east and you holler. Day or night. You hear, I hear. Naomi rode out. Liza stood alone at her husband's grave in the long gold light, and she let herself feel it, all of it, for exactly as long as she could stand to. Then she folded it up and put it away inside her, in the dry, hard place. And she walked back to the house with her spine straight and her chin level, because she had a feeling a cold, certain feeling, the kind her mother used to call el aviso, the warning that she was going to need every ounce of straightness she had. She was right. Wade Hollis came 4 days later. He came in the worst of the afternoon heat, the white flat hour when even the cattle stood still in whatever shade they could find. Liza heard the horses before she saw them more than one, a half dozen at least, and she set down the tin cup she was drinking from and walked out onto the porch and did not reach for the shotgun that stood just inside the door. She thought about it. She thought about it hard, but she'd learned something in 4 days of being watched. A gun in your hand changes the conversation. It tells a man you're afraid, and it gives him a reason to be afraid back. And fear stacked on fear is how people end up dead who didn't have to. So she left the shotgun where it stood, and she smoothed her apron with both palms, and she waited. There were 5 riders and 1 man at the center of them. She'd expected someone different. She'd heard the name Hollis for 3 years. The way you hear a name in a small county, sideways, in low voices, with the subject changing fast whenever a stranger walked up. People said he owned 3,000 acres south of the river and was buying more. People said the judge over in Fredericksburg owed him favors no honest man could name. People said a great many things and then looked at their boots. She'd built a picture in her mind of a hard man, a brute. What rode up to her porch was a trim, graying fellow of maybe 55, neat as a Sunday, with an open forehead and steady eyes and a mouth that rested all on its own in a small, easy half-smile. He had the kind of face that belonged in the front pew of a church. He wore his gun low, but so did half the men in Texas. He drew up 10 feet from the porch and touched the brim of his hat. Mrs. Calloway. His voice was warm. I'm sorry for your loss. Jonah was a fine man. The whole county feels it, mister. He looked around the yard slow. The way a man looks at a thing he's pricing. The well, the barn, the fence line running out to the near pasture, with one post leaning that Jonah had meant to fix. It's a hard place for a woman to run on her own, he said. No shame in saying so. It's a hard place for 2 strong men. The way the drought's gone. He looked back at her, and the half-smile was still there, gentle and reasonable. I came to take a weight off you. He nodded, and the rider nearest him, the broad one, red-bearded, who never once spoke, edged his horse forward and held out a folded envelope. The animal came close enough that Liza could feel its breath on the porch steps. A fair offer, Hollis said, given the times. Enough to set you up somewhere easier, somewhere with people around. A young woman shouldn't be out here by herself. It's no kind of life. Liza looked at the envelope. She did not take it. My husband's been in the ground 4 days, she said, which is exactly why I'm here. Ma'am, before things get away from you. Hollis's voice stayed soft as butter. Grief's a current. It pulls a person under before they know they're swimming. I've seen good families lose everything to it. I'd hate to see that happen to you. I'd hate it. I'm trying to do you a kindness. There it was. She heard it under the warm words. The way you hear the rattle before you see the snake. A kindness. As if the wolf had come to walk the lamb safely home. This land isn't for sale, Liza said. The half-smile did not move. That was the thing she noticed. A real face changes when it's told no. Hers had, his didn't. It stayed exactly where it had been arranged. And behind it, something cool turned over. Slow the way a card turns over on a table. Everything's for sale. Mrs. Calloway, he said. It's only ever a question of the price. And who's offering. And what happens to the folks who say no at the wrong moment. He let that sit. Then he tipped his hat again. Easy as anything. You think on it. Well, the smile. Some hurry. He gathered his reins. But Liza had decided something. Standing there in the white heat, with 5 gunmen in her yard and her dead husband 4 days under, and Naomi's voice in her ear. You do it by standing where you stand and refusing to move. Mr. Hollis. He stopped. She came forward to the edge of the porch. She did not raise her voice. She kept it level and quiet and clear, the way her father used to, gentle, a spooked horse. Because she had learned that quiet carries further than loud when a person is truly listening. My mother was from Coahuila, she said. Did you know that? Half the men in this county won't sit at a table with me on account of it. They look at my face, and they decide what I am before I've said a word. She held his eyes. So I know exactly what it is to be looked at like a thing instead of a person. I've had a lifetime of it. And I want you to understand something, so there's no confusion between us going forward. She let it land. I am not a thing in your way. I am not a fence you can step over. I am a woman standing on her own land, which her husband worked and loved and is buried in. And I am not selling it to you or to anyone. Not today. Not in a month. Not when the grief current pulls. As you say. Not ever. She paused. You can come back as many times as you like. The answer's going to be carved on the same stone every time you turn it over. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered behind the steady eyes. Not anger. She'd have understood anger. It was interest. The way a man looks up from his cards because someone's done a thing he didn't think the game allowed. Well, Wade Hollis said softly, I'm a person, Mr. Hollis. That's all I'm asking you to remember. He looked at her a beat too long. Then he reined his horse around and rode back down the lane without hurry. His 5 men folding in behind him like the closing of a fan. And the dust rose gold in the late light and hung there a long time after the sound of them was gone. Liza stood on the porch until she couldn't hear a single hoof. Then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and pressed both palms flat against the wood and breathed, slow and deep, until the shaking in her hands wore itself out. She thought about Jonah's hands. She thought about the rock shelf below the canyon and the lie the 2 hands had told with their eyes on the dirt, and the boy with the silver hatband who wouldn't take off his hat for a prayer. And she thought about a thing she had not let herself look at straight until just now. 6 men had watched her dig a grave. 6 men had ridden to her fence. A man who needed her gone had instead come to ask her, sweet as pie, to sign, not to leave, not to die, to sign. Why? A man who would kill her husband over a piece of land would not balk at killing her. Unless, and here, the cold, clean certainty settled into her, like a key turning in a lock unless a widow dead. 4 days after her husband was a story, even Wade Hollis couldn't sell. 1 Calloway thrown from a horse was an accident. 2 Calloways dead in a season was a question. And questions brought men with badges who didn't owe the Fredericksburg judge a thing. He didn't need her dead. He needed her name on his paper. And as long as she didn't give it to him, she was the one thing standing between Wade Hollis and whatever it was he'd killed Jonah to keep buried. Liza got up from the table. She crossed to Jonah's desk in the corner, and she opened the bottom drawer. and from beneath the ledgers she took out his mother's Bible, old, worn soft at the spine, the only thing he'd kept from the woman who raised him. She held it a moment. Then she rode the 11 miles to the telegraph office before the light went, with the leaning fence post throwing its long, crooked shadow across the lane behind her. And, at the counter, she wrote out a message in a careful hand to a man she had never met. A man Jonah had spoken of exactly twice in 11 years of marriage. And never for long. And never without something closing in his face, like a door pulled gently shut. A man the town of Cedar Hollow. On the rare occasion it spoke of him at all. Believed he'd been dead for years. She wrote it short. She had learned that. Too, that the fewest words carry the most weight. Jonah is dead. Not an accident. I need help, and I have no one else. Come if you can. Eliza Calloway. Cedar Hollow. The telegraph boy read it, and glanced up at her, and read it again. He had ink on his fingers, and a solemn look too old for his face. You sure about the name? Ma'am, he said. Calloway. There's only the one Calloway out your way now. And that's, he stopped, color rising. I'm sorry. I'm sure, Liza said. Send it. Where to? She told him. The boy's eyebrows went up, just slightly. But he bent to his key, and the small, bright clatter of it filled the little room, carrying her 7 words out across the dark country to the south, out toward a name Jonah had buried almost as deep as he was buried now. Liza rode home beneath a sky thick with stars. She did not know if the man would come. She did not know if he was even the man Jonah had described, or the man she needed, or any kind of man at all worth the wire she'd spent. 15 years was a long time. People changed. People died for real. People decided, somewhere down a long road, that they were not the kind to come home. But she had done the thing she could do, and tomorrow she would do the next thing. That was all a person could ever do. She was learning the next thing, and then the one after that, one hard, clean day at a time, refusing the whole way down to get small. Behind her, far back at the dark ranch, 6 men did not yet know that the widow they'd marked for easy prey had just reached out across the night and called for the one person in all of Texas they should have been afraid of. They thought she was alone. She was about to stop being alone. The wire said nothing for 3 days. Liza rode the 11 miles each morning and each evening, there and back. 22 miles of dust and heat. And each time, the solemn boy with the ink-stained fingers shook his head before she'd even finished tying her horse. Ma'am, sorry. Ma'am. And each time she rode home past the fence line. Hollis's men were there. Not all 6. 2, mostly. Sometimes 3. They came at 7 in the morning, regular as a church bell, and they sat their horses at the edge of her near pasture, and they watched. They didn't cross the line. They didn't call out. They didn't do one single thing she could carry to a sheriff. They just sat there in the early light, still and patient, the way buzzards sit a tree when something down below is taking its time about dying. The young one with the silver hat band was always among them. He'd taken to lifting 2 fingers off his saddle horn when she passed, a little mock salute, almost friendly, and that was somehow worse than a threat shouted out loud. A threat you could name. This you could only feel. She did not look at them. She kept her eyes forward and her hands steady on the reins, and she did her work, fed the chickens, drew the water, walked the troughs, counted the cattle, and she let them watch her do it, because there was nothing to do but let them. But she counted. She counted which men came, and what hours, and how long they stayed. and whether they ever changed the pattern. She didn't know yet what good the counting would do. She just knew that a person who pays attention is harder to surprise. On the third evening, she found the south gate standing open. She knew she'd shut it. She'd shut it that morning the way she shut it every morning, with the loop of wire over the post that took 2 hands and a good push. It didn't come open on its own. It never had in 11 years. 3 head of cattle had already wandered down into the dry wash, and she spent until full dark getting them back, working in the last of the light and then by feel, her dress snagging on cedar, a long scratch opening up the back of one hand. By the time she had the gate wired shut again and the cattle counted, the stars were out and her arms ached, and there was a hard knot of anger sitting under her breastbone. She did not have proof it was them. That was the thing. That was the whole genius of it. A gate could blow open. A wire could work loose. Cattle wander. There was nothing here to take to anyone. Only a widow's word against the quiet. And the quiet doesn't break the law. She rode to Sheriff Dawes the next morning anyway. Dawes was a heavy man with a soft face and kind eyes that had spent a long career learning to look just slightly to the left of anything inconvenient. He listened to her with his elbows on his desk and his fingers laced together, and he arranged his face into something close to sympathy. And when she finished, he sighed through his nose, a man who's been handed a chore he didn't ask for. "Mrs. Calloway," he said it gentle, "I want you to know that. But riding up to a fence, that's not a crime I can charge. They're on the public road, near as you tell it. They haven't threatened you." "Have they threatened you?" "Not in words you could write down." "Then there's nothing in words I can write down." He spread his hands. "And the gate. Well, a gate's a gate. You didn't see anyone open it. My husband is 12 days dead," Liza said. Her voice stayed level. She made it stay level. "Wade Hollis came to my door 4 days after the burial and asked me to sell. I said no. Now his men sit at my fence every morning, and my gate comes open at night. And you're telling me there's nothing here." She leaned forward. "You're a smart man, Sheriff. Don't sit there and tell me you can't see the shape of this. You can see it fine. You just don't want to." Dawes looked down at his laced fingers. "What I can see and what I can act on," he said quietly, "are 2 different things. Ma'am, and I'd thank you to remember, I've got a family." There it was, said almost to himself. And Liza understood, in that moment, something she hadn't fully grasped before, that the fear didn't stop at her fence line. It went all the way into this office, into this soft, kind man, into his laced hands and his family and his job. Hollis hadn't bought the law. He'd done something cheaper and more thorough than that. He'd taught a whole county to look slightly to the left. She stood up. "My husband always said you knew things. Sheriff Dawes." She put on her hat. He said it like it was a compliment. "I'm not sure I take his meaning anymore." She walked out before he could answer. She had one more stop in town, and she dreaded it more than the sheriff. She needed flour and coffee and a sack of nails, and the only place to get them was Pruitt's general store. And Pruitt's, on a market morning, was the beating heart of every opinion in Cedar Hollow. She felt the room change when she walked in. Not much, a small thing. A pause in the talk. A couple of heads turning, then turning back. She was used to it. She'd been used to it her whole life. There were women in that store who'd known her 11 years and still said that Mexican girl, Jonah, married when they thought she couldn't hear. The girl never aging, no matter how old she got. Because to them, she'd never quite be a grown woman with a name. She set her goods on the counter. Old Pruitt began to tally them, slow, and a man at the end of the counter, a rancher named Vint Polly, with a red face and a way of talking that filled a room whether anyone wanted it, filled or not, looked her up and down and said, loud enough to carry, surprised you're still out there. Ms. Calloway, big place like that. No man on it. He grinned around at the room, inviting them in. Course, I hear Hollis is fixing to take it off your hands. Generous of him. More'n I'd offer for ground that thirsty. A pause. More'n I'd offer a, he didn't finish it. But the room heard the shape of the word he didn't say. The same way Liza had heard the shape of the word the silver hatband boy never said. And a couple of people laughed. Low, the laugh that isn't really a laugh. Liza did not flinch. She finished counting out her coins onto the counter. Everyone, unhurried. The small clink of them, the only sound. Then she looked up. Not at Polly. At the whole room. At all of them. My husband, she said, is 12 days in the ground. I came to town for flour. She let it sit. There's not a person here who'd say a word like that to a man whose wife had just died. You'd take off your hat. You'd bring a pie. Her voice was very quiet, and it carried into every corner. The only reason it's open season on me is that I'm a woman, and I'm alone, and my mother was born on the wrong side of a river. That's the whole of it. And every one of you knows it's the whole of it. And most of you are decent enough to be ashamed. Which is why nobody's looking at me right now. Nobody was. I'd ask you to remember, she said, gathering her goods into the crook of her arm, that a person is a person, on either side of any river you care to name. My husband knew that. It's most of why I married him. She turned to the door. Good morning. The bell over the door rang behind her, bright and stupid and cheerful. Into the silence she left. She got all the way to her horse before her hands started to shake. Behind her, through the open door, she heard old Pruitt's voice, flat, dry, addressed to Vint Polly and to no one and to everyone. You owe that woman an apology, Vint, and you can buy your nails somewhere else till you've got the spine to give it. Liza closed her eyes a second. It wasn't much. One old man, half from conscience and half from spite. But it was something. It was the first something in 12 days, and she carried it home like a coal in a tin, careful in case it was the only fire she'd get. She didn't go through Jonah's papers again until that night. She'd been through them 3 times already, once in the gray fog of the first days, looking for nothing, once with purpose, looking for debts, once cold and sharp, looking for whatever it was that had kept him staring at the ceiling those last months, lying awake beside her with that low, grinding worry he never named. She hadn't found it. So this 4th time she changed where she looked. Not the deed box. Not the ledger. She picked up his mother's Bible, the one she'd nearly mailed south, then hadn't. Some instinct staying her hand, and she sat with it under the lamp and turned it over in her hands. And she felt along the worn cover, the way you'd feel a horse's leg for the heat of an injury. The back cover was thicker than the front. She worked a fingernail under the edge of the end paper, where the glue had let go. And from inside the cover, she drew out a single folded sheet, soft as cloth from being folded and unfolded many times. It was a survey, handwritten, a boundary survey, drawn in a careful hand, notarized in Fredericksburg, dated 6 months before Jonah died. And what it showed clear, plain, unmistakable. Once she understood what she was looking at was that the Eastern Canyon, the dry, rocky parcel that Wade Hollis had been running cattle on for 3 years, had fenced a section of, had spoken of in town as easy and settled as Sunrise. did not belong to Wade Hollis. It had always belonged to Jonah Calloway, and the line ran 400 feet east of where Hollis had set his fence. Liza sat very still. She thought about the canyon. She thought about the rock shelf below it, where they said her husband had struck his head. She thought about Jonah, lying awake, staring at the ceiling, carrying a thing too heavy to say out loud, riding out one bright, beautiful morning to a piece of ground he could prove was his. Her hands did not shake. They'd stopped shaking. She realized somewhere back in the second week. The grief had burned down past trembling into something with edges. She folded the survey exactly as it had been. She slid it back inside the cover. And she sat in the lamplight a long time, and out the dark window, somewhere down the lane. She heard a horse on the road that should not have been on the road at that hour. Coming, then gone. Counting, she thought, making sure I'm home. Let them count. She had something now they didn't know she had. And somewhere to the south. Please God, she had a man on his way. The wire came on the 5th day. 6 words. Slid across the counter by the solemn boy, who watched her read it the way you watch someone open a door. You're not sure you should have pointed them at. Coming, 1 week. Hold steady. See, that was all. No softness in it. No, I'm sorry. No, how are you? Just the bones of a thing, an arrival. A span of time. An instruction. Liza read it twice and folded it and rode home with it against her heart. And for the first time in 12 days, she slept the night through. 1 week, it said. It was 9 days before he came. By then, she'd built a careful little structure inside herself around the chance that he wasn't coming at all. That whatever 15 years had made of Caleb Calloway, it had made a man who said coming and meant maybe, the way some men did. She'd met them. The world was full of men who left a door open just enough to feel kind, and never once walked back through it. She was at the well on a Sunday morning when she heard the horse on the lane. She turned with the bucket in her hand, in no hurry, a lean man on a tired roan, his hat pulled low against the sun so she couldn't read his face until he'd crossed half the yard. And then he stopped the horse and sat there a moment, just looking at the place, the house, the barn, the leaning fence post. Her, and she looked back, and her breath caught hard in her throat, because he looked like Jonah, not the obvious way. He was darker and leaner, and his jaw was a harder line, and there were years cut into his face that Jonah had never lived to earn. But something in the set of his shoulders, something in the way he carried a weight without letting it touch his face. For one cruel half-second, it was her husband sitting that horse. Come back. And her heart leaped up like a fool before her head set it straight. He dismounted. He came toward her and stopped a respectful distance off and took off his hat. You'd be Eliza. Liza, her voice came out steadier than she felt. You're Caleb. I am. He looked at the well. Anywhere but straight at her. And she understood it wasn't rudeness. It was a man giving a grieving woman room to arrange her face. I'm sorry I'm late. There was a river up between here and there. And other things. You came, that's the part that counts. He looked at her then. Full on, and his eyes were a lighter brown than Jonah's. Almost amber. And there was something in them old and quiet and very far back. Like a lamp seen down a long hall. How bad is it? He said, not a question. Exactly, a man bracing. Bad, Liza said. Come inside. I'll show you everything. She laid it out on the kitchen table. Plain, no drama. Because she'd figured out by now that drama was a luxury she couldn't afford and didn't have the strength to spend. The survey, the funeral offer, The men at the fence. The open gate. Sheriff Dawes and his careful, practiced uselessness. The boy with the silver hat band and his two-finger salute. Caleb listened without once breaking in. He stood across the table with his arms folded and his eyes moving over the survey. And when she was done, he was quiet a long moment. And then he said, "You went to the law." "Yes, he gave you nothing. Less than nothing. He gave me the shape of nothing. Made it look almost like something. So I'd go home satisfied." Something moved at the corner of Caleb's mouth. Not a smile. A grim, dark, familiar kind of recognition. That's a man who's been gotten to. The judge in Fredericksburg, you know what Hollis has on him. I know there's something. Jonah believed the canyon claim went through the court crooked. Survey lines that didn't match the original grant. Paper that shouldn't have been filed. Filed. She put her finger on the soft folded survey. I think this is what got him killed. I think he found it. And got it notarized quiet. And was working out how much he could prove. And before he could prove enough. He had an accident on a horse he could ride in his sleep. Caleb looked at the survey for a long time. "They're going to keep coming," he said at last. "Every morning. They'll wear you down till you sign or till something worse happens. They'll make it so. The worst thing looks like an accident. 2. He looked up. You've got a gun. Shotgun by the door. Revolver in the bedroom." He nodded. Slow. "All right. Here's what I won't do. I won't ride up to Hollis's place and start something. I won't go looking for a fight in town. That's not how you win this. You win this with paper. In a court that man can't reach. And you win it by staying alive long enough to get there." He paused. "I'm going to stay in the bunkhouse. I'm going to watch them a few days. What time they come. How many, whether they rotate. And then we'll figure out how to get above that crooked judge." Liza studied him across the table. "There's something I need to say before you stay one night," she said. "And I need you to hear it all the way down." He waited. She put her hand flat on the survey. "I am not trying to start a war. I am trying to keep my land and find out for certain what happened to my husband. Those are two different things. And if there's any part of you that can't keep them separate, if you're the kind of man who came here looking for a reason, then I need you to get back on that horse and ride out the way you came. Today, with my thanks and no hard feelings." Caleb looked at her hand on the paper. He looked at her face. And for the first time, something in him eased. Just slightly. Like a man who's been waiting to find out if the ground will hold his weight and just felt it hold. "I understand the difference," he said quietly. "Better than most men alive. I'll keep them separate." He paused. "You've got my word. For whatever you reckon that's worth from a stranger. Jonah trusted you enough to wire you in the back of my mind for 12 days. Liza said, I'll start from there. That almost smile again. There and gone. He talked about me much. Twice in 11 years. She watched his face when she said it. And she saw the small thing it cost him. And she didn't look away from it. Because she'd had enough of people looking away. Both times, he stopped before the end. Like a door pulled shut. Caleb turned his hat slow in his hands. "That's a different story," he said, "for a different time." "All right," she said. She didn't push. She'd learned the value of letting a thing keep until it was ready. Different time. He moved his few things into the bunkhouse that afternoon. And he asked her quiet, careful questions about the lay, where the water sat, which way the canyon ran, who her nearest neighbors were, and which she trusted. She told him about Naomi. She told him about Pruitt and the nails. He listened to all of it the way he'd listened at the table, taking it in and turning it over and saying little, and she began to understand that the quiet wasn't emptiness. It was a man who had spent a long life gathering things in places where asking out loud could get you killed. Toward evening, he came and stood with her on the porch, and they looked out at the fence line together, gold in the falling light, the leaning post throwing its long, crooked shadow. "They'll come tomorrow," he said, "at 7. 2 of them, most likely. The boy with the silver hat'll be one. And they'll see me." He said it not quite to her. He said it to the fence, to the men who weren't there yet. The way a man tries a thing out loud to hear how true it sounds. "They'll ride back and tell Hollis there's a stranger on the Calloway place. And Hollis is going to want to know who I am. What'll you do when they come?" "Nothing." He looked at her, and the last light was full on his face. And again, for just a breath. It was Jonah standing there. And again, she set her heart straight. "I'm going to drink my coffee and let them look. Tomorrow's just for looking." A pause. "But I'll tell you this much. Since you asked me plain, and I owe you plain back." He looked down the lane, to where the dust of no one at all hung in the gold air. "They've spent 12 days teaching you that you're alone out here," Caleb said. "Starting tomorrow morning. That lesson's over." Liza stood beside her husband's brother in the dying light, and she felt something she had not felt since the morning 2 ranch hands rode in with Jonah across a saddle. She did not feel safe. She wasn't a fool. Safe was a long way off, if it ever came at all. But she felt, for the first time, that she was not carrying it by herself, and she understood standing there, watching an amber-eyed stranger watch an empty road, that this was its own kind of strength. Maybe the realest kind there was. Not offense. Just one other person who'd decided your trouble was theirs too, and meant it. "Good," she said, and she meant it all the way down. They came at 7, just like she'd said. 2 of them. The boy with the silver hatband and the broad red-bearded one who never spoke. They rode up the lane, slow and easy, the way they always did, and they parked their horses at the edge of the near pasture. And the boy lifted 2 fingers off his saddle horn in that little mock salute. And then he stopped, because Caleb was on the porch. He wasn't doing anything. That was the thing Liza would remember. He sat in the chair Jonah had always sat in, with Jonah's old tin cup in his hand, and he drank his coffee. And he looked at the 2 men, at the fence the way a man looks at weather he isn't worried about yet. He didn't stand. He didn't reach for anything. He just looked. The boy looked back. For a long while, nobody moved, and the only sound was a meadowlark down in the grass and the small, dry creak of the windmill turning. Liza stood at the well with the bucket in her hand and felt the morning change around her. Felt the air pull tight the way it does before a storm you can't yet see. The boy said something to the red-bearded man. Liza couldn't hear it. The red-bearded man said something back. And the third thing that happened was that Caleb lifted his coffee cup, just slightly, in their direction. A greeting, almost friendly. The 2 men sat their horses another minute or 2. Then they turned and rode back down the lane. And they didn't say a word. And they didn't lift 2 fingers. And the dust hung gold behind them a long time after they were gone. Liza walked up to the porch. "That's it," she said. Caleb drank his coffee. "You didn't do anything." "I did the most important thing." He looked up at her, and there was that almost smile. There and gone. "I let them see I wasn't afraid." A man who isn't afraid is a question they can't answer sitting on a horse. So they went to go ask somebody who can. He set the cup down. "By tonight, Hollis'll know there's a stranger here. By tomorrow, he'll know my name. And once he knows my name," he stopped. "What? Things'll change." He stood and stretched, slow, and looked out at the empty lane. Not all at once, but they'll change. Naomi rode over that afternoon on her gray mare and tied up at the rail without ceremony. I heard Caleb Calloway was back, she said, before she was even fully down. Town's chewing on nothing else. He is. Liza nodded toward the bunkhouse. Good. Naomi looked that direction. Hard, the way she looked at everything. Because I'll tell you what else. The town's chewing on. Wade Hollis was at Pruitt's yesterday evening, asking after him. Quiet. The careful kind of asking where you don't ask. The question you're actually asking. She climbed the porch steps and lowered herself into a chair. He was talking to Vint Pauley about drifters, men who pass through. Described a fellow lean, dark, mid-40s. Quiet said he was just trying to place a face. Liza felt something tighten under her ribs. And did anyone place it? Pauley didn't know him from Adam. But Lula Marsh was in the store. Naomi let the name sit, and her face finished the sentence. Lula Marsh knew everything about everyone in the county, and had never once kept a word of it to herself. She remembers Caleb riding through, years back. She knows who he is, what he was, which is what. Naomi looked at her a moment. You don't know, he hasn't said, and I haven't asked. The old woman was quiet. Then, that's his to tell. Then, not mine. But Liza, she leaned forward, whatever he was. It's the kind of thing that makes a man like Hollis think twice. And a man like Hollis, when he thinks twice, he doesn't get gentler. He gets careful. And careful men are the dangerous ones. Because they don't make the mistakes the loud ones make. She stood, joints cracking. You watch yourself. Both of you. She rode out the way she came. Caleb hired Eli Freeman the next morning. He did it without asking Liza. And she didn't mind. Because he asked her something better. First he asked who in the county was honest and good with his hands. And she'd said Eli Freeman without a half-second's pause. Eli kept the smithy at the edge of town. He was a free man, had been all his life. Born up in a part of Ohio where that meant something. Come down to Texas after the war with a wife and a wagon and a set of tools, and built the best forge in 3 counties out of nothing but skill and stubbornness. Half the town wouldn't shake his hand. The other half were happy enough to use his ironwork and call him boy while they paid for it. Caleb rode in and shook his hand and called him Mr. Freeman, and hired him to fix the fence and reset the leaning post and look over the whole line, and brought him out to the ranch in the wagon. The two of them talking easy the whole way, and the town watched them go and chewed on that. Liza brought water out to where they worked in the heat. She watched Caleb hand Eli a tool and take one back, the way 2 men work who respect each other's hands. She watched him listen when Eli said the corner post wanted digging deeper or it'd lean again by spring. She watched him say, "You'd know better than me," and mean it. And at noon, the 3 of them sat in the thin shade of the barn and ate. And Eli said, wiping his brow, "I'll be straight with you, mister. There's men in town won't be glad you brought me out here. They'll say things. To you. Not to me, they just go quiet." He said it plain. No heat, a man stating weather. I don't want to make trouble land on this place that's already got enough. Kate chewed a while before he answered. My brother's wife, he said, nodding at Liza. Got told something ugly in Pruitt's last week, on account of where her mother was born. And an old man named Pruitt told the fellow who said it to go buy his nails somewhere else. He looked at Eli. There's 2 kinds of men. Mr. Freeman, the kind who decide what you are before you've opened your mouth by your color, or your mother's. or whether you've got a husband standing next to you, and the kind who wait to find out who you are by what you do. He took a drink of water. I spent a lot of years among the first kind, some years being the first kind. If I'm honest, I'd rather spend the rest among the second. That's the whole of my politics. You do good work. I'll say so out loud, in town, where they can hear me. The ones who don't like it can dig their own post holes. Eli looked at him a long moment. Then he almost laughed a short, surprised sound, like a man who'd forgotten he could. All right, he said, then let's set this post so deep your great-grandkids curse me trying to pull it. That evening, Caleb taught her to shoot. He didn't make a ceremony of it. He just came to the porch at dusk with a revolver and a box of shells and said, "You know how to use this. Point and pull. That'll get you killed." He said it without unkindness. Come on. He set up bottles on a stump out past the barn, in the long gold light. And he showed her how to stand, and how to hold the thing so it didn't jump out of true, and how to breathe, let half of it out and hold. Then squeeze. Don't pull. Squeeze, like you're surprised when it goes off. She was bad at first, then less bad. The fourth bottle she hit dead center, and it burst, and the sound rolled away across the pasture and came back off the ridge. She lowered the gun. Her ears rang. Her heart was going hard, and she realized, with something like surprise, that it wasn't fear making it go. "Why are you teaching me this?" she said. "You're the one who's supposed to be the gun." Caleb was quiet a moment, reloading, his hands sure in the failing light. "Because I won't always be on the porch," he said, and because he snapped the cylinder shut. He looked at her. "For 12 days before I got here, 6 men taught you that you were something small, something to be watched, something to be waited out. Pray," he handed her the loaded gun. "But first, I'm not teaching you this so you'll kill anybody. With luck, you never will. I'm teaching it so you'll never feel like that again. So that, whatever you decide to do, you decide it because you chose to, not because you were too afraid to choose anything else. That's all a gun's good for, in the right hands. Not killing. Choosing." Liza looked at the weapon in her hand. It was heavier than it looked, and warm now from firing. And it didn't make her feel powerful. Exactly. It made her feel like a person who had options, which she was learning was nearly the same thing. The light went down behind the ridge. The bottles glinted on the stump, and the two of them stood out in the cooling dark, not touching, a careful arm's length apart, both of them aware of the distance and the reason for it. And neither of them said a single word about it. A dead man stood between them. After all, they both knew it. They both kept their distance from it. The way you keep your distance from a fire you're grateful for. He rode out alone one afternoon and didn't say where. And Liza spent the hours he was gone bent over Jonah's accounting ledger at the desk in the corner, looking not for what was there, but for what wasn't. Jonah had been a careful man. His columns ran straight. His figures sat where they belonged. His handwriting was the same neat print at the end of a long day as at the start of a fresh one. And she loved that about him, the steadiness of it, the way you could read his whole nature in a column of sums. But in the last 6 months before he died, something had changed. Nothing you'd catch unless you were already looking. The gaps between entries grew. A water rights payment that should have shown up in March had no receipt against it. A boundary inspection he'd paid for in February was logged as done, but the inspector's name had been written, then crossed out, then written over as a set of initials she didn't know. RAF. She was still staring at it when Caleb came in at dusk and shut the door behind him. "Sit down," she said, not looking up. "I need to show you something." He sat. She walked him through it slow, the way she'd walked herself through it, not jumping ahead, letting the pattern build at its own pace. The gaps, the missing receipt, the crossed-out name. He listened the way he listened to everything. And when she finished, he reached over and put one finger on the initials. "RAF," he said. "Ambrose Finch. Richard Ambrose Finch." The judge. The room seemed to go still around the name. Jonah was paying him, Liza said. It wasn't a question. Caleb turned back 2 pages and pointed at a column she'd flagged and not understood. "Look which way the entry runs." Jonah logged it as money coming in, not going out. Somebody was paying him. Liza stared at it. She'd read that page 4 times and missed it cold. For what? For staying quiet, my guess, or trying to make it look like he would. Caleb sat back. "Here's how I read it, and tell me where I'm wrong. Finch was passing something through your husband, his property records, his good standing in this county, to make the Canyon claim look clean on paper. Hollis grabs the land. Finch dresses it up legal. And Jonah Calloway honest. Respected. Married into an old name, gets paid a little to look the other way and lend his good name to the lie. And when Jonah figured out what his name was buying, he stopped taking it. Caleb tapped the place where the entries thinned, and he started writing it all down. They sat there across the desk from each other, in the last of the light, with a dead man's careful handwriting between them, and Liza felt something settle into her chest. Not peace. Nothing like peace. A clarity. The cold kind, with edges and a direction. That's almost worse than grief, because grief at least lets you sit still. He knew, she said. He knew they were going to kill him. Caleb didn't answer. He knew, she said again. And he didn't tell me. He was trying to protect you. He was wrong. The flatness of her own voice surprised her. She meant every letter of it. I was his wife. Caleb, not a child to be kept in a safe room while the grown folks handled the danger. If he'd just told me, we could have taken this to somebody. Gotten it out. Gotten it filed somewhere that crooked judge couldn't reach. We could have done it together, while he was still alive to do it. She pressed her palm flat on the ledger. Instead, he carried it by himself till it killed him, and left me to find it after. Alone, 12 days behind. Caleb was quiet a long moment. When he spoke, he was careful. He was a good man. I know he was a good man. That's not the same as right. She looked up, and her eyes were dry, and her voice was steady. And that steadiness cost her more than tears would have. A person can love you and still get you wrong. Caleb. Jonah loved me more than his own life. I never once doubted it. Not for an hour in 11 years. But he thought loving me meant carrying things so I wouldn't have to. And that's not love. Not all the way. That's deciding for somebody. That's looking at a grown woman and seeing somebody who needs handling. She shook her head slow. I'd have stood beside him in this. He never gave me the chance to. He made me a widow before he made me a partner. She heard herself say it, and it landed in the quiet room. And she understood she'd been carrying it unsaid for weeks. I forgive him for it, she said, softer now. Or I will. I'm not there yet. I'm still too angry. And I think I've got the right to be angry a while longer. But I'll get there. She closed the ledger. I just won't do it again. Ever. Nobody decides for me what I'm strong enough to know. Not even to be kind. Especially not to be kind. Caleb looked at her across the desk for a long time. Something in his face had changed a kind of careful attention. The look of a man revising what he thought he understood. My brother, he said slowly, always told me he married up. I figured he meant the land. He didn't have any land worth marrying up to. The drought saw to that. No, Caleb said. I don't expect he meant the land. She let that sit. It was as close to a kindness as either of them could afford, with the dead man so near. Then she stood and lit the lamp, because the dark had come on full while they talked. And she said, "What'd you find this afternoon?" "You rode out for a reason." "I rode the canyon line." He leaned forward into the lamplight. "Your husband's survey, it matches the old grant markers. The original stones are still out there, most of them. But some have been moved. Not far, just enough to shift the line on paper. You'd never see it unless you knew to look. I knew to look." He turned his hat slow in his hands. "I marked where they sit now, and where the old sockets are. Took measurements. It's not enough on its own to stand up in a court, but put it with Jonah's survey. And the ledger, and that crossed-out name, it's enough to start. It's enough to start." He paused. "But we need somebody who knows land law. Somebody who can take all this and build a thing that survives a judge. And we can't go through Finch." "No," Liza thought a moment. "The circuit comes through Fredericksburg in August." Judge Morrow. Jonah spoke well of him, said he was one of the last ones Finch and Hollis hadn't bought. If we could reach him, if we could get all of this in front of a federal court before Hosses decides the moment's right. Caleb nodded slow. "How long's August?" 3 weeks. That's a long time to keep a man like Hollis patient." "He's not patient." Liza shook her head. "He's something colder than patient. He's calculating. He'll move the day the sum comes out in his favor. The day he reckons there's nobody left who'd ask the right questions if I disappeared." She looked at Caleb across the lamplit desk, at the amber eyes and the hard jaw and the grief he carried where it didn't show. "So we make sure that day never comes. We make the sum never add up. We keep something he can't reach. Somewhere he can't reach it. And we let him know we've got it, so that touching me costs him more than leaving me be." Caleb looked at her a moment, then the almost smile. Longer this time. And something behind it that might have been respect, or grief, or both wound together too tight to tell apart. "Jonah said you were brave," he said. "He didn't say you were this brave. I think maybe he didn't know. He knew at the end," Liza said. She thought of the survey, folded soft from many openings, hidden in his mother's Bible where he'd have known she'd look someday. He just figured it out too late to tell me. She turned the lamp up, and the light filled the room. And outside the window, the hill country went about its ordinary night, the creek running low, the insects, something calling once in the cedar and going still, the sound of a world that did not know it was, holding its breath. They made a copy of the survey by lamplight, the two of them, the night before Liza wrote it out to Naomi's. It was Caleb's idea, and a good one. Leave a copy where Hollis's men would find it if they came searching visible, in the desk drawer, with Jonah's reading glasses set on top to make it look kept and precious. Let them take it and think they'd solved the thing. And the true one would be 2 miles east, under an old woman's hearthstone, with a widow nobody was watching. Because nobody figures the old widow's part of this. Caleb said, "That's her armor, being underestimated. Same as yours. Near enough." Liza copied every line in Jonah's drafting pen, slow and careful. And it was close to 2. In the morning when she finished and held the 2 sheets up to the lamp together. She wasn't a draftsman, but she'd kept the ranch books 11 years. And she had a steady hand and a true eye. And she thought she hoped that a man in a hurry, expecting to find what he was looking for, might not catch the difference. She set the pen down and rubbed her eyes. Caleb was still up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, gone, cold in front of him, looking at nothing. "You don't sleep," she said. "Not much." He turned the cup a quarter turn on the table, the way some men do with their hands, when the rest of them is somewhere else. "You asked me once why I left. Both times Jonah said my name." He stopped before the end. "You remember." "I remember. You said you'd let it keep till it was ready." He looked up. "It's the middle of the night, and I'm not going to sleep anyway. And tomorrow you ride, out alone in the dark with the one thing in this county worth killing for. So maybe it's ready." Liza sat down across from him. She didn't say anything. She'd learned that, too, that the surest way to stop a man from telling you a hard thing is to look too eager to hear it. Caleb was quiet a long moment. He said, 1873. I was working a range dispute. Cattle theft. Mostly I'd hire on to track men who'd taken what wasn't theirs and bring them back, or bring back word of where they'd gone. It was honest work. Mostly. The law was thin out there. Men like me were the only law a lot of folks ever saw. He turned the cup again. I tracked a man near the Pecos. He'd run off a dozen head. And there was paper on him. Legal paper. And I had every right to bring him in. I cornered him in a stand of cottonwoods by the river. I told him to throw down. He stopped. He drew instead. And I shot him. And that was clean. That was inside everything I was hired to do. Inside the law as it ran out there. A man draws on you. You shoot. There's not a court in the territory would have blinked. But, Liza said, but he had a boy. Caleb's voice didn't change. And the not changing was the worst of it. 14. Come out of the trees right after. Must have been waiting with the horses. Came out and saw his daddy on the ground and me, standing over him with a gun, still in my hand, and the smoke still on it. He looked down at the cold coffee, and the boy looked at me. The way a person looks at a thing they can't live through understanding. Like the world he'd woke up in that morning was gone, and he didn't have another one to step into. The lamp ticked. Outside, far off, a coyote said something to the dark and was answered. "Did you hurt him?" Liza asked. The boy, "No." Caleb said it fast. Hard, like the question itself was a thing he had to push off. "No." I put the gun away. I got him to the nearest town and left him with the church there, and money enough to keep him a while. I filed my report. I collected my fee. He shook his head slow. Did everything a man's supposed to do. And then I rode out. And I couldn't stop seeing his face. Months, I saw it. Year, near enough. I'd be falling asleep, and there it'd be. And you started asking yourself, Liza said quietly, what kind of work makes a man into the thing in a child's worst memory? Caleb looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, surprise. Maybe at being understood so exact. That's it, he said, near to the word. I figured, if that's what the work made of me. I didn't want to be the kind of man who came home and sat at a family table with that on him. Jonah wrote me the spring after, asked me to come back, said there was a place for me here. He turned the cup. I wrote back and said I wasn't the kind of man who came home anymore. And I kept saying it. For years. Every time he wrote, and he kept writing. He never quit. I'd find a new way to say the same thing. I'm not that kind of man. Were you right? He was a long time answering. No, he said at last. I think I was using that boy as a reason for something I was scared of for other reasons entirely. It's easier to say I'm too dangerous to come home than I'm too afraid to. One makes you sound like a hard man with a code. The other just makes you a man who couldn't sit still long enough to be loved. He almost smiled, and it was the saddest one yet. And I think Jonah knew that. I think that's why he never stopped writing. Not because he needed anything off me, because he knew I needed a door left open, even when I kept swearing I'd never walk through. Liza thought of the survey, folded soft, hidden where she'd find it, of the letter she didn't yet know was waiting in Fredericksburg, of all the doors Jonah had left open, quiet, for people who didn't know, yet they'd need them. That was Jonah, she said. He always knew which doors mattered. Yeah? Caleb's voice had gone rough. He cleared it. Well, now you know why I left. And you know the other thing. 2. The thing I'm telling you, so you can decide whether you still want me here for what's coming. What thing? He met her eyes across the lamplight. I'm not going to become that man again, he said. Not here. Not in Jonah's house. Whatever Hollis brings. I am going to keep you and this land safe, and I am going to do it without standing over anybody with smoke on the gun while a child watches. I need you to know that's a line I've drawn, and I need you to know it's a line that might cost us, if it comes to a hard moment, and I won't cross it. Liza looked at him a long while. Jonah didn't ask you to be careful, she said. In the back of my mind, when I wired you, I didn't ask you to be careful either. I asked you to come. She reached across and, after a breath, put her hand briefly over his, where it sat on the cold cup. Just a moment. Then she took it back. Whatever you became in those years. Caleb Jonah knew who was underneath it. He bet a lifetime of letters on it. I'll bet what I've got left. Caleb looked down at his hand where hers had been. He was usually right about people, he said. Almost always. She said, now we should both try to sleep. I ride before light. She left him there at the table, turning the cup. She didn't know, couldn't have known, that 2 days south, in a low adobe cantina outside Bourne, Wade Hollis was sitting across a sticky table from a thin, hollow-eyed young man of 19, buying him whiskey he didn't have the stomach for, and saying, soft and friendly, Tobias, that's a good name. Listen, son, I hear you've got a reason to want a certain man dead. A man who came through New Mexico, years back. A man with smoke on his gun and a boy left standing in the trees. Hollis turned his own glass a quarter turn on the table. Funny thing, that same man just rode into a place where I've got business. Now, how'd you like to do some work for me? The boy's hands shook around his glass. He didn't say no. They came on a Thursday, just past 2 in the morning, when the dark was at its deepest. Liza wasn't asleep. She hadn't truly slept in weeks, and she'd stopped pretending she would. She lay in the bed she'd shared with Jonah for 11 years and listened to the ranch the way he used to, not for any one sound, just for the shape of it, the way the dark moved across the land, so that when something shifted, she'd feel it before she could name it. She felt it at 13 minutes past 2. Not a sound, an absence. The horses in the barn had gone quiet in a way that wasn't sleep the way. Animals go still when they're paying attention to something they can smell, but can't see. She was out of bed before the thought finished. Boots, dress over her nightclothes. The revolver from the nightstand, loaded the way Caleb had taught her to leave it. She moved to the window low and looked out. 2 horses, tied at the far fence. Not the porch rail, the far fence, where they wouldn't be heard. 2 shapes near the bunkhouse, 1 on the porch. 3, at least. Maybe more she couldn't place. She needed Caleb, but Caleb was in the bunkhouse, and 2 of them were headed there. She made herself think, slow and clear. because the only other thing to do was panic, and panic would get her killed, and get him killed, and put Jonah's survey in Wade Hollis's hands before August ever came. The man on the porch tried the front door, barred from inside. He tried it twice, 3 times, harder each time. Then a pause. Then she heard him move toward the office window. She moved faster, down the back hall, into the kitchen, the shotgun up off its pegs and into her hands. She put her back to the wall, beside the door to the office, and she waited. And her heart was going hard. And her hands, she noticed this from a long way off. Like watching someone else, her hands were steady. The office window gave with a low crack of wood. And then, from the bunkhouse, a shout cut off short. A crash, another, heavier. Then silence, a different kind of silence, and then Caleb's voice. Low and flat, and carrying just far enough. Don't, one word. But the way he said it, Liza breathed. She heard the man in the office now, moving through the dark. Hands on the desk. The drawer, the particular sound of someone searching fast and trying not to make noise. He went to the desk first, then back to the desk. And then she heard the thing she'd been waiting for, the soft slide of paper. The man finding the copy where she'd left it, folded under Jonah's reading glasses, looking like the most precious thing in the house. She heard him unfold it, heard the paper settle, heard the small grunt of a man who thinks he's done his job. She stepped into the doorway, put it down. He came at her fast. She had maybe a second to decide, and she did the thing Caleb had drilled into her without ever quite saying it. She stepped left, not back, because back was what he expected, and left put him off his angle. His arm caught her shoulder instead of her throat and spun her hard into the door frame. It hurt. It didn't matter. She kept the shotgun. She came up with it, leveled before he could turn. And her thumb was on the hammer, and her breath was half let out and held. Just like the bottles on the stump. I said, she told him. Put it down. He stopped. She could see him now heavy-set. A short-brimmed hat knocked half off. The blank, careful face of a man hired exactly because he didn't feel much of anything. He was breathing hard and holding the folded paper in one fist and looking at the shotgun the way a man looks at a thing he badly misjudged. On the desk, she said. Then out the window you came in. He put it on the desk. He went, slow, backward, his hands where she could see them, and he climbed out the broken window into the dark. She heard him hit the ground, heard him run, heard the horses at the far fence go off hard into the night. Then she heard nothing. And then Caleb was in the kitchen doorway. He had a cut over his left eye, bleeding into his eyebrow, and he was holding his right side with one hand in a way that told her something had connected there. But he was standing. He was steady. And his face was the same as it always was, that infuriating, beautiful calm. 2 in the bunkhouse, he said. They won't be a problem tonight. Are they alive? Yeah, he said it plain. And she understood. It was an answer to a question under the question. I didn't kill anybody. Tied. They'll keep till morning. Liza set the shotgun against the wall, and then her hands started to shake, that delayed shake that comes after, when the body finally catches up to what the mind already handled and decides to handle it too, from the other direction. She looked at her hands. She made them stop. It took a while. He got the copy. She said, Good. Caleb leaned against the frame. So are you. Worse, she crossed the room and looked at the cut over his eye. Not deep. She'd seen worse on Jonah after a bad day with Greenstock. She went for the basin and a cloth and cleaned it without sentiment. And he sat still under her hands and didn't complain. And for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. Then Caleb said, "He'll take that copy to Hollis tonight. Hollis will have it by morning. And by morning, he'll know it's a copy. Maybe, maybe not right off. The notarizing's in the right spot. The numbers are close." He winced as she pressed the cloth. "Close enough to buy us a day. Maybe the real one's safe with Naomi. He doesn't know that. He thinks he just took the only one in the world. One day," Liza said, "one day's enough. We use it to get ahead of him." She finished with the cut and stepped back to look at her work. And there was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not tension, the opposite of it. Almost. A sharpened kind of aliveness. Like a man who's been moving towards something a long while and has just felt it come into reach. "You already know what we're doing tomorrow," she said. "We're going to Fredericksburg," Caleb said, "and we're going to find out where Judge Morrow is. Before August." But that wasn't the thing in his face. The thing in his face came after. When he'd finished the coffee, she made them both. And they were sitting in the kitchen with the broken window, letting in the cool of the dark. And one of the men tied in the bunkhouse started up a low cursing they could just hear across the yard. Caleb went out with the lamp to quiet him. He was gone a long time. When he came back, his face had changed entirely. The calm was still there, but under it, something had gone tight and strange. And he sat down across from Liza slow, like a man setting down a weight he hadn't expected to pick up. "What is it?" she said. "The younger one. The one I tied second." Caleb stared at the lamp. "I got a good look at him just now, with the light, and I know him." He swallowed. "Liza, I know his face. I've been seeing his face for 15 years. He's the boy from New Mexico, from the cottonwoods by the Pecos." He looked up, and, for the first time since he'd ridden up her lane, Caleb Calloway looked like a man who didn't know what to do. He's grown now, but it's him. It's the boy who watched me kill his father. The lamp ticked. Outside, in the dark, the boy in the bunkhouse had gone quiet again. Caleb didn't sleep at all that night, and neither did Liza. At first light, they went out to the bunkhouse together. The older one, the heavy man, glared at them, sullen from where he was tied. But the boy, Tobias, the older one, called him once. Sneering, the boy sat with his knees drawn up and his back to the wall and his eyes fixed on Caleb with a look Liza had no name for. Hate was part of it. But under the hate was something younger and worse. Grief that had set crooked, like a bone that healed without anyone there to set it straight. Caleb crouched down in front of him, slow, careful, his hands open and empty. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. "Then you were waiting with the horses, by the river. You came out after." The boy's jaw worked. He didn't speak. "I've seen your face every year since," Caleb said. "I want you to know that. Not so you'll feel sorry for me. You don't owe me that, and you never will. I'm telling you because it's true, and you've had a lot of lies told to you. And I figure you've earned at least one true thing from the man who owes you the most." He took a breath. "Tobias, there's no soft way around it, and I won't try to find one. He drew on me, and I shot him, and he died. And I had the law on my side. And none of that mattered one damn bit to a 14-year-old boy in the trees. I knew it didn't matter then. I've known it every day since." The boy's eyes had gone wet. He blinked it back hard. "Hollis find you?" Caleb asked. "Or you find him?" "He found me." The boy's voice cracked on it, first words he'd said, and they came out rusty. 2 weeks back. Knew all about it. About the Pecos. All of it. Said you'd turned up here." Said he stopped. said you could finally make it right. Caleb finished. Quiet, said you could be the one to put me down. The boy didn't answer. Which was answer enough. Liza understood it then, all the way down. And the cold cleverness of it made her sick. Hollis hadn't stumbled onto this boy. He'd gone looking. He'd reached back 15 years and 1,000 miles and found the one person in the world with a true reason to want Caleb dead. And he'd polished that grief up and pointed it like a gun. A boy's whole life of pain turned into a tool. Used Tobias, she said, and the boy's eyes flicked to her. Wary, he used you. You know that. The man who put that whiskey in front of you and told you old stories. He doesn't care about your father. He never met your father. He saw a wound he could open and aim. That's all you are to Wade Hollis. A loaded gun he didn't have to pay much for. The boy's face twisted. He threw at Caleb. You think you're better. You shot my no. Caleb didn't raise his voice. I'm not better. I did a worse thing to you than Hollis ever has. I took your father. And Hollis only took 2 weeks of your life and a little of your pride. If you're keeping a tally, mine's the bigger debt by a long way. He let that sit. But here's the thing I came to say. And then I'll leave you be. I can't give him back. I'd give my own life to. And it wouldn't buy back a minute of his. That door's shut, and there's no opening it. So I won't insult you by asking you to forgive me. That's not mine to ask. He stood up, slow his hand at his hurt side. What I can do, he said, is keep you from becoming me. You've got a gun in your hand and a man pointing you at murder. Same as I was pointed once, by men who called it law. And I will tell you, what I wish to God somebody had told that boy by the Pexos before he ever picked up the work. Caleb looked down at him. Every bullet leaves somebody standing in the trees. Everyone. You pull a trigger for Wade Hollis. And somewhere there's another kid who watches a man go down, and the wheel just turns again. And you've become the thing you've hated your whole life. That's the only thing I know for certain in this world. Tobias, the only true thing I've got to give you, or you can keep it turning. But nobody breaks it for you. You break it yourself. Or it doesn't break. He turned and walked toward the door. They killed a man here, Tobias said. Caleb stopped. The boy was looking at his own hands now. At the canyon, back in the summer. I wasn't in it, I came on after, but I saw. The other two. The ones Hollis sent there was a man up there with surveying tools. Wouldn't leave. And one of them moved on him from behind and put him off the ledge. His voice had gone flat and far away. The way Caleb's did when the worst things came out. I've been carrying it 2 weeks. Since I figured out the man I'm supposed to help is the same kind that did that. I don't. He stopped. Started again. I don't want to be that. I don't think I ever did. I just didn't have any place else to be. Liza had gone very still. You'd say that, she said softly. To a judge. What you saw at the canyon. The boy looked up at her. He looked at Caleb for a long moment. Like exactly what he was, a frightened young man standing at the one fork in a road that he'd remember for the rest of his life. The place where the wheel turns or doesn't. My pa was a thief, he said slow, but he wasn't a murderer. He'd have spit on a man who'd push another man off a ledge for money. He swallowed. Yeah, I'd say it. To a judge, I'd say all of it. Caleb crouched back down. This time, he took out his knife and cut the ropes from the boy's wrists. The older man across the bunkhouse spat. You're a fool, kid. Hollis, Caleb said, not even looking at him, is going to have a great deal more to worry about than this boy. He helped Tobias to his feet, out in the yard. The morning was coming up gold and pink over the limestone ridges, the way it did, the way Jonah had loved. Indifferent and beautiful over all of it, over the broken window and the tied man and the boy who'd just chosen, with his own two hands, to step off the wheel and down the lane. Far off, a rider came at a hard gallop, and Naomi's gray mare resolved out of the dust, and the old woman was already calling out, before she reached them, her voice carrying thin across the cool air. The judge, Liza Judge Morrow's coming through early. Words all over Fredericksburg. Hollis knows it, too. He was in town last night. And he knows that paper of yours has teeth. And Liza, she hauled the mare up short. He's not going to wait for any court. Not now, whatever he's going to do. He's going to do it soon. They moved fast that day. But they didn't panic. Liza had decided somewhere back that panic was a thing she wouldn't spend energy on. And Caleb ran on the same fuel. So they used the day instead of fearing it. He sent Naomi home and made her take the two prisoners with her, the heavy man and one she'd gathered up, tied secure in her barn. I need a witness who isn't here when it happens, Liza told her, when Naomi balked. Somebody alive and believed, and far from the gunfire. If it goes wrong tonight, somebody has to carry all of this to that judge. I need you to live through this more than I need you beside me. Naomi had looked at her a long time. You're smarter than Jonah let on, she said. I keep hearing that. She rode out with her prisoners. Tobias stayed. He'd asked to, and Caleb had let him. After a long look that passed something between them, Liza couldn't read. They got ready the slow, careful way. Caleb checked every door and window. He moved the horses to the back pasture, away from the buildings, in case Hollis chose fire. He walked the perimeter twice, what little ammunition they had where they could reach it, and said almost nothing while he did it. And Liza answered him in the same few words, because they'd built a working language by now that didn't need more. In the afternoon, he came into the kitchen and sat down and said, "There's a thing I need you to hear before tonight." "Say it. My plan is to hold this place and hold those papers till morning. That's the whole of it. Nothing else." He turned his hat in his hands. "I told you I drew a line about not becoming that man again. I need you to know I mean to hold that line tonight, even if it costs us. I won't stand over anybody with smoke on the gun. Not in Jonah's yard. Not with that boy watching." He glanced toward the window, where Tobias sat on the bunkhouse step, cleaning a rifle slow, especially not with that boy watching. Liza looked at him. "Jonah didn't leave you that choice in any letter," she said. "He didn't write tell Caleb to be careful. He wrote well. He never wrote it to me. But I'd bet he never wrote it to you either. He just kept writing, because he knew who you were under the work." She reached over and, for the second time, put her hand briefly on his. "Hold your line. We'll win it your way, or we won't win it worth keeping." Hollis came at 9. He didn't bother with the dark this time. He came in the last of the dusk, with enough light left to be seen by. And that was the message: I'm not sneaking anymore. 6 riders, spread wide across the lane. A lit torch in the hand of the man on the far right. The flame standing straight up in the still evening air. And Hollis at the center, on his gray horse, with the look of a man who has finished his sums and likes the answer. Liza was on the porch. Caleb was not in sight. That was on purpose. Hollis drew up at the rail. He looked at Liza. "The paper my man brought me," he said, "was a copy." It was. "Where's the real one filed?" "Fredericksburg." Liza's voice was level. "Along with certified copies of the original Calloway grant, my husband's sworn account, and a Quest to convene the federal circuit early. Judge Morrow will have all of it within the week. Something settled in Hollis's face. Not the explosion she might have braced for. He was too cold for that. A kind of coming up, like dark water, rising through the boards of a floor. That filing won't survive Judge Finch's review. It won't go through Finch. She let it sit. It's federal. It goes over his head entirely. That's the whole point of it. Mr. Hollis, you spent 3 years buying a county judge. You can't buy your way past the United States. He looked at her a long moment. Then he looked at the torch on his right flank, then back at her. And what crossed his face then was the cold arithmetic of a man deciding exactly how much worse he was willing to make this. Mrs. Calloway, he said, be reasonable. I have been reasonable for 6 weeks. Her voice didn't rise. It went the other way, quiet and very clear. So it carried to every man in that yard. I was reasonable when you came to my door 4 days after I buried my husband. I was reasonable when your men sat at my fence every morning. I was reasonable when 2 of them broke into my house in the dark and put their hands on me. She took 1 step forward on the porch. I'm done being reasonable. You're trespassing. Get off my land. That was the first beat. The man with the torch shifted in his saddle, and the flame trembled. And for a long breath, the whole yard hung on the edge of the place where words run out, and the next move is the kind you can't take back. Then Hollis said, soft, burn it. The man drew his arm back to throw. A shot cracked. It came from the bunkhouse. And for 1 terrible half-second, Liza's whole body went to ice. Certain Caleb. They've got Caleb, but the torchman's flame went spinning sideways out of his hand, struck dirt, and lay there guttering. And the man clutched his wrist where a bullet had passed close enough to numb it. He hadn't been hit. He'd been missed, exactly on purpose, by a marksman who'd chosen to. Tobias stepped out from the bunkhouse corner, rifle up, levered, aimed dead at Wade Hollis's chest. That was the second beat. Don't anybody throw anything, the boy said. His voice shook and held. Don't anybody move. Hollis turned slow in his saddle and looked at him, and a smile came up on his face, almost fond. Tobias, son, what are you doing? After everything you used, my daddy's dying to point me at a man. The rifle didn't waver now. You reached back 15 years and 1,000 miles to find a boy with a wound, and you opened it up, and you aimed me, like I wasn't even a person, like I was a thing you found lying around. His jaw worked. I've been a thing to everybody my whole life. Mr. Hollis, I'm done being one. Starting tonight. And then Caleb stepped out from the dark at the corner of the barn. He had nothing in his hands. That was the third beat. And it was the one that turned it. And it turned not on a gun, but on the lack of one. He walked out slow into the half-light, with his hands open and empty, and his eyes moving across the 6 men one at a time. And he stopped. And he spoke. And he didn't raise his voice. Every man here, he said, is now a witness to attempted arson and armed trespass. 2 of your men are tied in a neighbor's barn, and that neighbor is on her way to a federal judge with everything she's seen. The papers are in 3 places you can't reach. There's a boy here who'll testify. He saw your men put Jonah Calloway off that ledge, and now he'll testify to this. 2, he let it land. I rode with the law a lot of years. I know how to file a thing that sticks. So I'll ask you all one question, and then you can each answer it with your own neck. Is this job worth going to federal prison for a dead man's land? Nobody moved. Then the man whose torch lay guttering in the dirt looked at his own numb hand and looked at Hollis. and reined his horse back a step. Then another did. Then a third turned half away. The way men turn when they've decided a thing and don't want to be looked at while they do it. "Hold," Hollis said sharp. "Hold. Damn you." But the door had already settled into its frame. You could feel it go. That particular tension that lives at the very edge of violence, when violence stops being the next available thing. It leaves all at once, like air out of a struck lung. Hollis looked at his men. His men looked at the dirt. He sat his gray horse alone, then in a yard full of people who had decided, each in their own small way, that they wouldn't. "My husband's name," Liza said, into the quiet, "was Jonah Calloway. He was 41 years old. He was the best man I ever knew. And you killed him for 400 feet of dry canyon." Her voice was steady and quiet and held no theater in it at all. "You looked at me and saw prey. You looked at this boy and saw a tool. You looked at Jonah and saw a name to use." She held his eyes. "But a person is no one's prey, and no one's tool, and no one's to be used. That's the thing you never learned, in all your years and all your acres. And it's the thing that's going to take it all back from you, starting tonight, in a federal court, where I am going to say every word of this out loud." Hollis held her gaze a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode out, and his men went with him, all six, the torch left dying in the dirt, the sound of the hooves fading into the dark. Liza stood on the porch. Her legs weren't quite steady. She noticed it from a distance, the way she'd noticed her hands the night of the break-in, the body catching up to what the rest of her already knew. Caleb came up beside her. Tobias lowered the rifle and stood looking at it, like he wasn't sure whose hands it was in. "He's not done," Liza said. "No," Caleb said, "but he's done here. The rest of it happens in front of a judge now. And that's the one fight, Wade, Hollis was never going to win. The Fredericksburg courthouse had never held so many people. Walter Pruitt told Liza so in a low voice when she came, and old Pruitt, who'd thrown Vint Polly out of his store over a word, sitting up near the front like he'd earned the seat, which he had. The room was 3 deep along the walls and spilling out the doors onto the steps. Word had moved through the county the way word does in a place where everyone has been holding their breath about one thing for a long time. Fast, crackling. A whole community that had needed permission to say out loud what it had only ever said in private. Hollis was already there, at the respondents' table, with 2 lawyers brought in from San Antonio. He looked at Liza when she came in, and it wasn't the pleasant half-smile anymore, and it wasn't the cold of the porch. It was something else. The face of a man who has felt the ground shift in a way he cannot shift it back. Finch sat off to the side, alone but for his own lawyer, very still. A man doing sums that all came out the same and didn't like any of them. Judge Abel Morrow was 65, spare and gray, with a face that had spent decades watching people lie to him and had built an accurate instrument for it. He took his seat without ceremony and looked out over his glasses. "This court is in session," he said. "We will have order and we will have brevity. I have read the filings. I have questions. We'll begin." They began with the records. Pruitt's clerk friend, Walter, testified to the original grant, the Hollis filing, the 400-foot lie in the survey numbers, Jonah's visit back in February, and the letter Jonah had left in his keeping, a letter Liza had only learned of 3 days before, that she'd read standing at a counter with her dead husband's careful print, swimming in front of her. "Eliza is braver than I have always given her credit for, and she will see this through if I cannot. The clerk answered every question, without flinching. Hollis's lawyers objected 4 times. Morrow sustained none of them. Then Morrow looked out at the room. The original grant, filed in this county in '71, places the eastern boundary 412 feet east of the line claimed in the Hollis filing. Those 2 numbers do not represent a surveyor's error. They represent a deliberate alteration. He looked at Hollis's table. I'll give all parties the chance to account for that. We'll begin with the petitioner's witness. The young federal lawyer stood. The petitioner calls Tobias Hale. The room went still. The boy walked up from the back, lean and pale, in a clean shirt Liza had pressed for him that morning with her own hands. He sat. He put his hands flat on his knees, the way a man does when he's afraid they'll shake. And then he made the mistake of looking, just once, at the respondent's table. Hollis was looking back at him. Nothing on his face. Nothing anyone could object to. Just a long, flat, fixed stare. The same stare he'd turned on a frightened boy across a sticky cantina table. The one that said, "Remember what I know about you. Remember what you are. Remember who made you." And Liza saw the boy's hands tighten on his knees. Saw the color leave him. Saw him open his mouth and find nothing in it. The silence stretched, and Liza did the only thing she could do, which was nothing except she leaned forward in her seat, just slightly, into the boy's line of sight. And when his eyes flicked to her, she did not nod, did not mouth a word, only looked at him the way Naomi had once looked at her. You don't do it by getting small. You do it by standing where you stand and refusing to move. Tobias looked at her. Then he turned his eyes off Hollis. Deliberate. The way you turn off a thing that has power over you, only as long as you face it. And he looked at the lawyer. And he said, in a voice that started rough and got steadier with every word, "I was near the canyon the morning Jonah Calloway died. I came on after it started. There was a man up there with surveying tools, and he wouldn't leave. Said it was his land and he could prove it. And one of Mr. Hollis's men moved on him from behind and put him off the ledge. He swallowed. It wasn't a fall. It wasn't an accident. I've known it 6 weeks, and I've been a coward about it 6 weeks. And I'm done being one." The room did not make a sound. Hollis's lead lawyer spent 20 minutes trying to find a crack in the boy, and found none because the truth has a kind of structure a built story doesn't. And Morrow watched the trying with the face of a man who's seen it before and isn't impressed. Liza had not let herself hope for. Finch's own lawyer stood before Finch was ever called. "Your Honor, my client wishes to address the court directly on the matter of his role in preparing and notarizing the Hollis filing." The room shifted not a sound, but a pressure, a held breath. "The court will permit it," Morrow said. Finch stood, still silver-haired, still upright. But the assumption was gone out of him, the thing that had walked into a land office once with a deputy at his side, certain of his own immunity. What was left was just a man of 60 with no road behind him. In the spring of '86, Finch said, Wade Hollis came to me about the canyon boundary. He represented that the original survey contained an error. I did not verify the numbers. I notarized the corrected filing on his word. A pause, a longer one. I was later made aware the representation was false. I did not act on it. I allowed the filing to stand, and I allowed pressure to be applied to Jonah Calloway to keep him from challenging it. He stopped. I am prepared to give a full account and to cooperate with any investigation. He sat down. The room broke open. Morrow called for order 3 times before he had it. He looked at Hollis's table, and his face needed no interpreting. Mr. Hollis, your attorneys will tell you that the next several minutes are among the most consequential of your life. I suggest you use them well." Hollis looked at Finch the way a man looks at a wall he built coming down on him. His lawyer leaned in and murmured. Hollis listened. His face didn't change. Then he said, "To the room," almost conversational. "I dispute every material claim made in this proceeding." "Noted," Morrow said, "and irrelevant to what I'm about to say." He looked out at the full room, at all the people, three deep against the walls, who'd come because they needed to be there when it finally came out. Then he looked at the petitioner's table, at Liza. The Eastern Canyon parcel reverts to the Calloway estate, effective immediately. The 86 filing is void in its entirety. All improvements placed on that land by the Hollis operation constitute trespass. He looked at the federal marshal's man. "I am referring the death of Jonah Calloway to the marshal's office for criminal investigation, with the testimony of Tobias Hale entered as record." He looked at Finch's lawyer. "Your client's cooperation will be noted. His conduct will be investigated." He looked at Hollis. "Last and longest, Mr. Hollis, I would not leave this county." There was one more thing, and Liza watched for it. And it was the thing she'd remember longest. When Eli Freeman took the stand to testify to the moved boundary stones he'd measured and marked, there were men in that room who'd never sat in a court while a black man's word was weighed and believed. Liza watched the judge, and Morrow leaned forward and took up his pen and listened to Eli Freeman with exactly the same close attention he'd given. Every white witness before him asked him the same hard questions, wrote down the same careful notes, and at the end said, "Thank you, Mr. Freeman. That's useful and clear. No speech about it. No lesson spoken out loud. Just a man's word measured by its truth and nothing else." In a room full of people who saw it happen. Some of them for the first time in their lives. That, Liza thought, said more than any words could have. The order arrived at the ranch on a Thursday. Liza signed for it at the door and carried it to Jonah's desk and read it through. Every line. The way he'd taught her without ever quite saying, so that the details matter. That the precise language is the whole difference between a thing that holds and a thing that comes undone. It held. She put it in the deed box. She put the key in her pocket. Then she went out to the south fence, where Caleb was working in the August heat, resetting the corner post. Eli had dug deep enough to outlast them all. "It's done," she said. "The canyon's ours. The marshal's office has the investigation. They arrested the man who pushed him, picked him up in San Antonio yesterday morning." Caleb straightened, the tool in one hand. He looked at her with the thing that was simply him, under the calm and the almost smile. The thing Jonah had known better than he'd ever shown. "Jonah did that," he said. "He built every piece of it." "We finished it," she said. He looked at her a moment. "Yeah, we did." She sat on the fence rail and looked out at the canyon ridge, in the distance hers now. On paper, a court couldn't reach. And in the ground, where her husband had walked it. The heat was on her face, and the rail was solid under her, and she felt. For the first time since two ranch hands had ridden in with Jonah across the saddle. The actual ground beneath her own 2 feet. Solid, specific. "Hers, Caleb," she said. He went back to the post. "Steady stay," she said. He worked a moment without answering. I'm not saying anything more than I'm saying. It's too soon for more than I'm saying. And we both know why. And we'll let it be." She watched the ridge. "But this land's too big for one person. Tobias needs somewhere to be that isn't a wound somebody's pointing. And Jonah left a door open for you a long time, and kept it open. because he knew you'd need one. I'm just telling you it's still open. That's all. Stay. Caleb set down the tool. He put his forearms on the rail beside her. Not touching. The careful distance still there. The dead man still given his room. And he looked out at the same ridge, the same sky, the same indifferent, beautiful light coming down gold over the limestone the way it had the morning she became a widow. Let me get Tobias settled first, he said, and the trial finished out. After, Liza said, yes, stay. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no, either. And in the morning when she came out to the porch, before light with her coffee, he was already there, in Jonah's chair, watching the sun come up over the ridge the way Jonah always had, and a little ways off, on the bunkhouse step. Tobias sat watching it too, a boy learning what an ordinary morning felt like, when nobody was pointing him at anything. Liza stood in the doorway and looked at the three of them, and the land, and the light. She thought about all the small, quiet, unremarkable acts of courage that had carried them here. Not the standoff in the yard, that was the loud part. The part they'd tell their grandchildren. The quiet ones. Naomi riding 2 miles in the dark to hide a paper under a stone. Old Pruitt telling a man to buy his nails elsewhere. Eli setting a post deep when he could have set it easy. A frightened boy turning his eyes off the man who owned his fear and telling the truth anyway. Jonah planting seeds in February, in ground he might not live to see harvested, trusting that someone would come and tend them. That was where it lived. She understood now, not in heroes. There were no heroes, only ordinary people. In the small, hard moment between looking away and speaking up, choosing to speak. That was the whole of it. That was all justice had ever been made of. She stepped out onto the porch and sat in her own chair and wrapped both hands around her cup. And the three of them watched the hill country come back to light. Jonah, she thought, we're all right. We're going to be all right. And they were. This story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment purposes. Any names, characters, events, locations, or situations portrayed in this narrative are either the product of the author's imagination or used fictitiously, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental.
And so, when the sun finally rose over the hill country, it did not rise on a perfect world. It did not erase Jonah's grave. It did not give Eliza back the years that had been stolen from her, or return Caleb to the man he might have been before guilt taught him to run, or make Tobias forget the boy he had once been, standing among the cottonwoods with his whole life broken open in front of him. But it did rise on a world that had changed, because a few ordinary people had decided silence was no longer enough. That is the heart of this story. It is not simply a tale about land, or a corrupt rancher, or a widow fighting to keep what belonged to her husband. It is a story about dignity, the kind that no man can buy, threaten, bury, or burn. Wade Hollis looked at people and saw only what he could use. He saw Eliza as a weak widow, Tobias as a loaded weapon, Jonah as a name on a paper, Eli as a man whose truth could be ignored, and a whole town as something that could be trained to look away. But he was wrong in the one way cruel men are always wrong. He forgot that people are not tools. They are not fences to step over. They are not wounds to reopen for profit. They are not shadows standing beside someone else's power. Every person carries a name, a grief, a story. and a line they may one day refuse to cross. Eliza's strength was not that she never trembled. She trembled often. Her hands shook after the danger had passed, and her heart broke in places no one could see. Her strength was that she kept choosing the next right thing anyway. She buried her husband. She faced the men on the ridge. She walked into town when the town wanted her small. She spoke when others were ashamed to look her in the eye. She learned the truth, protected it, carried it forward, and refused to let anyone decide for her what she was strong enough to know. That is one of the deepest lessons this story leaves behind. Love is not protection when it becomes silence. Jonah loved Eliza, but he made the mistake many good people make. He tried to carry danger alone, believing that secrecy was kindness. And in the end, Eliza teaches us that real love does not hide the burden from someone. Real love trusts them enough to stand beside them. Caleb's journey teaches another lesson. A man cannot outrun the worst day of his life forever. Guilt follows quietly. It sleeps in the saddlebag, sits beside the fire, and waits in the silence. But Caleb proves that a person's past may explain them without owning them. He could not undo what happened by the Pecos River. He could not give Tobias back his father, but he could refuse to become the same kind of man again. He could lay down the old way of violence and choose a harder road restraint. Truth, witness, and mercy. And Tobias, perhaps more than anyone, shows us that pain can either be passed on or broken. Hollis tried to turn his grief into a weapon, but Tobias chose to stop the wheel. He chose to tell the truth, instead of firing another bullet into the future. That choice matters, because every act of cruelty asks for an heir, and every cycle of revenge survives only when someone agrees to carry it. Tobias refused. Naomi, Pruitt, Eli, Caleb, Tobias, and Eliza all remind us that justice is rarely made by one grand gesture. Justice is built out of small, stubborn acts. An old woman hiding a paper beneath a hearthstone. A storekeeper refusing to laugh with the crowd. A black craftsman setting a fence post deep and speaking the truth in a courtroom. A frightened boy turning his eyes away from the man who owned his fear. Of a widow standing on her porch and saying, "Get off my land." None of those choices alone looked like enough, but together, they became stronger than Hollis's money, stronger than his threats, stronger than the fear he had planted in an entire county. That is the meaning this story gives us. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes courage is quiet. Sometimes it is simply staying in the room when shame tells you to leave. Sometimes it is telling the truth with your voice shaking. Sometimes it is refusing to let grief make you cruel. Sometimes it is admitting that a good person was wrong, that a wounded person can still choose better, and that a frightened community can still remember its conscience. In the end, Eliza did not win because she became hard like the men who threatened her. She won because she remained fully human in a world that kept trying to make her less than that. She grieved. She raged. She forgave slowly. She accepted help without surrendering herself. She stood beside others and allowed them to stand beside her. And maybe that is the greatest lesson of all. No one survives the hardest seasons alone. We need the now miss who ride through the dark, the Pruitts who speak up in public, the Ellis who do honest work when the world undervalues their hands, the Calebs who come back through doors left open, and even the Tobiases who remind us that redemption can begin at the very moment a person refuses to be used anymore. So when we leave Eliza on that porch, watching the land come back to light, we are not meant to believe that pain has vanished. We are meant to believe that pain did not get the final word. Fear did not get the final word. Hollis did not get the final word. The final word belonged to truth, to dignity, to community, and to the quiet courage of ordinary people who chose, one hard moment at a time, not to look away.